All right, what's going on, everyone? So I feel pretty confident at this point in saying that the number one salesperson for NATO membership over the course of the past 10 years is Russian President Vladimir Putin. It's just, if you look at the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022, it is hard to find a more unifying event for the NATO alliance than those two acts. And to try to drive that home, I thought I'd run through some comments made by foreign ministers of allied nations given at NATO's 75th anniversary ceremony last week in Brussels. This is coming from Chair of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, again at the 75th anniversary ceremony. And I'm going to go straight from his comments into a song that I recorded there, just because it hit home for me. Big Band of Brothers fan, history nerd. I probably only watched that series 27 times, so not as many as most of you. And former 101st Airborne guy, so big fan of the song choice. And I think to give you the vibe, we'll go straight from the speech into that song. But Admiral Bauer, again, give you an idea of when he only has 1 to 2 minutes, what are the things he's going to focus on. He says, starting with 12, we have now grown into an alliance of 32 armed forces. In a world where authoritarian regimes are desperately trying to portray an image of strength and brutal tyranny strives to take away the sovereign rights of peoples and nations, we need that shield more than ever. Today, we celebrate our band of 32 brothers and sisters, allies separated by oceans but united in our determination. Together we are stronger, together we are more, together we are NATO. Now, there is an argument to be made that NATO is expanding, which isn't really an argument. NATO has expanded. It is larger today than it's ever been in their history. But there's a couple key aspects of that I think are usually missing from the discourse. First is countries have to ask to be a part of NATO. They're not involuntarily pulled in, right? These are nations that are seeking out that decision, wanting to join the alliance, and then looking at why they made that decision. And we'll get into that here in a second. But for a lot of these countries, especially in Eastern Europe, that decision was life or death. They viewed it as either join NATO, join this alliance, or potentially be overrun by either the Soviet Union, now Russia, or some other nation to where they lose their ability to operate as a sovereign state. So looking at some of these speeches from the 75th anniversary ceremony, there were a handful of things that stood out to me that I thought were worth relaying to you to really highlight that the focus of the alliance right now really is Russia and Ukraine. So a lot of these folks, they had 1 to 2 minutes max in front of a large audience on camera, and these are the things they decided to focus in on, just to give you an idea of how important it is. Starting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, he said, "We tried to embrace Russia, but we knew that the potential for violence was there. Unfortunately, Russia is on the march again. But happily, we are where we belong, in the company of democracies, among friends at home, resisting again, like a rock, let's prevail again." And Secretary General Stoltenberg really drilled home one of the two aspects I want to focus in on here. One is the growth of NATO in terms of member states joining the alliance. And then the second that I'll get to in a second is the increase in defense expenditures across the alliance, both tied to 2014 and 2022. So in Stoltenberg's comments at the anniversary ceremony, he said, 2014 and Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea was another turning point. Since then, we have undertaken the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in generations. Today, NATO is bigger, stronger, and more united than ever. In the beginning, we had 12 members. Today, we are 32, so we must be doing something right. And that was a theme while we were there that they kept pointing back to, was that growth is a sign that people want to, that countries and populations want to be a part of the alliance, that more and more countries are wanting to be brought into the fold as an indicator that the alliance, that NATO as a whole is on the right track. Again, kind of a focus of what they were talking about while we were there. Now, in the U.S., we tend to think of NATO as an alliance, a alliance, one of many. But for many of our allies in Europe, it's better viewed as like the alliance. It's a cornerstone of their defense policy. And for some of these countries, their membership in NATO is kind of the main reason that they feel that their borders are secure from any sort of foreign invasion. So I think we miss that a lot in the United States. NATO is an aspect of our foreign policy. It's an aspect of how we deploy military power around the world. But for some of these countries, there's arguably nothing more important than their membership to NATO. And I think it's hard to view that from each other's perspective. Looking at a couple more statements here from foreign ministers. This is from the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Czechia, who said, while signing the NATO accession protocol, the late President Havel said, quote, "It gives us hope that our country will never again be sacrificed to an aggressor," end quote. And at the same time, it expresses a clear commitment to share responsibility for the freedom of nations, human rights, democratic values, and peace on our continent. Russian aggression against Ukraine gives those words new urgency for my country. Again, over and over and over again, the Russian invasion, the Russian aggression against Ukraine is being used as a rallying cry all across NATO. And, one of the ways that has kind of manifested since 2014 is 4 new member states into the alliance. And some of those, 2 especially, were kind of unexpected. Finland had long cooperated with NATO, but they had a policy of military non-alignment that was really popular across the country. But in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. That changed. They applied for, and in 2023 became the 31st member of NATO. And it's a pretty similar story to Sweden, who also had a policy of military non-alignment, but also, following Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, applied to become a member of NATO, and earlier this year, in 2024, became the 32nd member state of the alliance. So some of these newest members, the 2 especially, Finland and Sweden, the reason for their joining, the reason for them kind of reversing their long-standing non-alignment military policy is directly due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? We're not having to beat around the bushes or try to somehow tie one thing to another. That is the main reason that some of these countries are entering the fold of NATO. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia kind of hit on this during their speech, where they said, when Estonia regained our independence in 1991, we decided one important thing: never to be alone again. Because we were under 50 years of the Soviet Union occupation, we lost 1/5 of our population. We made a crazy decision to join NATO, and it would seem to be impossible at this time. And the reason was that neutrality policy in the neighborhood of Russia meant the green light for occupation and aggression. Unfortunately, the situation is the same. Russia is still an aggressive country, and neutrality policy is still a green light for aggression from the Russian side. That's how we feel, that it is not impossible. It is not a crazy idea to bring into NATO those nations who would like to join, as Ukraine, because we have experienced this momentum. And I should mention that this part came up a fair amount, not as much as just directly talking about the Russian invasion, but there was a fair amount of talk of general support or the possibility of Ukraine joining the NATO alliance. Personally, I heard it a lot more from member states during some of their speeches than anyone in NATO leadership per se. But you kind of pick up on that as things, reappear in the conversation over and again. So I'm not sure entirely what the general support is inside of NATO for Ukraine to join the alliance, but it's pretty obvious that there is some degree of support across a handful of member states. Now, another thing I wanted to point to here in terms of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has kind of impacted the NATO alliance is defense expenditure. So what the various countries inside of NATO are spending on their defense budgets. And we've got a couple different graphs I want to pull up here. Looking back to 1989, the defense spending across NATO was either declining or pretty flat until Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, which led to a more than 40% increase in the collective defense spending over the course of the past 10 years. So NATO is arguably better funded and more well-resourced now than in their entire history. Now, there's a lot that goes into that, right? It's not exclusively dollar amounts that say how prepared a country or a group of countries is for a future war, but that is a factor defense spending, and it's a pretty easily measurable one. And since Russia began encroaching on Ukrainian territory in 2014, it has been a rallying cry across NATO for an increase in military readiness. And that's not just a bump in U.S. military spending. Across the board, the U.S. does spend more on their military than I think the rest of NATO combined. I have to double check that. But there has been an increase in U.S. defense spending by 12% over the course of the past 12 years or past 10 years. But Europe and Canada accounted for a 42% increase. So the U.S. again still spends more, but I think that's, that increase, that 42% defense spending increase in Europe is reflective of how Europe sees Russian aggression as a very near-term threat to their sovereignty and the overall well-being of the European continent. So again, just looking at how things have changed since 2014, you've got an increase in member states, 4 new members since 2014, 2 of those directly tied to Russian aggression in Ukraine, and then a significant uptick in military spending. So in wrapping up, just some of my takeaways from this short visit out to the headquarters is how unifying the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been across the NATO alliance. Of course, nobody wanted Russia to invade Ukraine, but since 2014, it is hard to point to an event that has brought the NATO alliance, the allied countries, closer together, more unified against a common threat, has increased the number of member states and increased defense spending across the organization. It's not a stretch to say that NATO is arguably stronger and more influential today than they've ever been in their history, which is saying something. It's probably, the opposite of what Putin was going for when he kicked off his invasion. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. We changed the name recently to Between the Lines with Preston Stewart because it's not just me. I am contributing, but we're pulling in a lot of experts from various fields. Talk about things like China using pirates, little blue men in the South China Sea. We've got Afghanistan and Russian relations, how ISKP is playing into that, and quite a bit more. Of course, linked in the description below if interested. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.